Israel and Judah have now both been led into captivity, Israel into Assyria and Judah into Babylonia. It would seem that the promises of God have fallen flat. After all, what nation has ever been restored from captivity and assimilation by another nation? But this is God's nation, and God has made many promises through the prophets like this one. And it shall come to pass in the latter days that the mountain of the house of the Lord shall be established as the highest of the mountains, and shall be lifted above the hills, and all the nations shall flow into it. And many people shall come and say, Come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Even while they were in exile, the prophet Daniel spoke these words to Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever. The dream is certain, and its interpretation is sure. How is it possible? Historically, the tribes of Israel were either lost in Assyria, fled to the surrounding nations, or were assimilated by Judah. The Assyrians replaced Israel by farmers from other nations to work the land. There is some debate about whether there were any Israelites left in the land or not. These tribes, often referred to as the lost 10 tribes, were not to be heard from again. These are the eventual consequences of Rehoboam's unwise decision, if you'll recall, to place a heavy tax burden upon the people. The result was a faction, Jeroboam's rebellion, and the departure of the northern tribes of Israel into idolatry. There are only 3 books of the Bible that tell about the history of the people of God during the Babylonian captivity: Ezekiel, Daniel, and Esther. There are other books which tell more about the history of this period in the so-called Apocrypha, books that were not accepted into the Jewish or Christian canons of Scripture, but are included in the Catholic canon. While in exile, the king watched his near kinsman killed. He was then blinded and carried away in chains to Babylon. But God did not abandon his people in Babylon. It is there that our history continues. The 3 prophets, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, form a relay team. Jeremiah prophesied first, before the Assyrian army descended on the northern tribes. He continued to warn Judah that her destruction would follow. Ezekiel joined Jeremiah's efforts to warn Judah that her destruction was imminent, and that he followed Judah into Babylonian captivity, where he continued to prophesy against foreign nations. Like other prophets, most notably the prophet Isaiah, he ends his writing with a message of future hope for the children of Israel. You'll agree that to be prophesying future hope and national restoration during exile is extraordinary. Daniel began his prophecies from inside Babylon. Once in Babylon, the Lord had instructed the Israelites to make themselves at home. They were not to try to overthrow the Babylonian government, to be disruptive to the Babylonian ways of life, or to be discontented with their conditions. Instead, they were to become productive, supportive members of this foreign society. And they did. Among the first exiles to Babylon was this young man by the name of Daniel. He was among the choicest young men of Judea and served in the court of the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar, who had overthrown Jerusalem. The book of Daniel records the reign of the famous Nebuchadnezzar and his successors. It also tells of the interactions of these monarchs with God through Daniel. But the book also accurately forecasted long into the future of the Israelites, including the fall of Babylon to the Medes and Persians, reestablishment of the Jewish kingdom in Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the temple, and the fall of Persia to Alexander the Great, and the treachery of the Greek Empire over the reestablished Jerusalem. He did so through a series of visions and dreams that were often conveyed to kings, and that he credits God with interpreting through him. During the time of Daniel, the Jews thrived in Babylon. When Babylon was overthrown by Cyrus the Great of Persia, the Jews were given leave with provisions to return and rebuild Jerusalem. Among those who returned were prophets, Ezra and Nehemiah, a high priest, Jeshua, who was a proper Levite of the descent of the priests, and a prince, Zerubbabel, from the clan of David. Thus they had all the makings of a new nation under God: a prophet, a priest, and a king. The wall of Jerusalem and the temple having been rebuilt, the nation entered into its so-called Second Temple period. It was during this period that the prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi wrote. Also during the post-exile, the book of Esther was written. This is the story of a young Jewish woman who became queen of Persia by winning a beauty pageant held at the order of the king. The story tells of how she risked her life to save her people from extermination due to the conniving of an evil villain named Haman. Her victory resonates in Jewish history in the Feast of Purim, which is celebrated to this day. For about 400 years after the prophet Malachi, the God of heaven would remain silent. There would be no more literary prophets until the prophecies of Daniel would reach their fruition. The prophet Isaiah foretold of one who would precede the coming of the great Messiah, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, "Prepare the way of the Lord." Join us again next time as we learn what happened to the Jews during the ups and downs of this eventful period in world history that lies between the Testaments. We'll talk about the rise and fall of the Greek Empire and the political battles that are fought in Israel. We'll learn about where the Pharisees and Sadducees came from and how the Herods began to rule in Israel, setting the scene for the coming of the Anointed One of Israel. Join us, won't you?